Well, hello, welcome, and thank you to you all for tuning in and joining us for our very latest Oceanographic Roundtable discussion. It's great to see such a robust audience join us online for this event, this being our fourth in our almost new and becoming increasingly established series of weekly roundtable events. It's a chance each week for oceanographic audiences around the globe to join us as we dissect and dive into some of the biggest headlines across the ocean news and ocean storytelling space. Regular participants will notice that today I have cast off the shackles of our London office and have left the confines of the M25 entirely, because today we are live from Edinburgh, where Oceanographic is currently taking part in the Blue Marine Foundation's Wavemakers event, part of the Edinburgh Ocean Leaders Programme up here in Scotland. Now, already in this series of live discussions, we have tackled the topics of the UK sewage crisis, the effectiveness of marine protected areas, and the pervasiveness of microplastics. So if you're keeping track, then be sure to tick this one off your bingo card too this week as we dive into the latest and the most stark warning to date from the World Meteorological Society, whose 2025 climate change report warned just last week that all of the key climate indicators are now flashing red. So here's a bit of the background to that story. So last week, the World Meteorological Organization's State of the Global Climate Report for 2025 confirmed that Earth's climate is more out of balance than at any point in recorded history. The 11 years from 2015 to 2025 are the hottest ever documented. Greenhouse gas concentrations are at their highest in 800,000 years. And the human cost is already tangible. Extreme weather in 2025 caused thousands of deaths and has impacted millions around the globe. The ocean, of course, sits at the center of this story because it's absorbing more than 91% of the excess heat trapped by greenhouse gases. Its rate of warming has more than doubled in the last 2 decades, and ocean surface pH levels has declined for 41 consecutive years. Sea levels are now 11 centimeters higher than when satellite measurements began back in 1993, and the IPCC warns that changes to deep ocean chemistry are effectively irreversible on timescales of centuries to millennia. So that all paints a pretty bleak picture. But despite it all, there is plenty to take heart and to take hope from, with scientists and policy advisors working around the globe to drive conversation and positive action forwards. And I am delighted to be joined by 3 such individuals this afternoon. Those experts are Dan Crockett, Executive Director at Blue Marine Foundation, who focuses on marine protected areas and ocean governance at a global level. Hey, Dan, thanks for joining us. Dr. Aline da Silva Sequeira. Aline is a Brazilian-born marine biologist, conservation scientist, and ocean literacy advocate whose career spans marine ecology, coastal policy, and community engagement across 2 continents. Aline, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's a pleasure. And then finally, we have, of course, Professor Christopher Merchant. Christopher is a professor of ocean and earth observation at the University of Reading, where he leads an active research group in the thermal remote sensing of sea surface temperature, including leading the European Space Agency's Climate Change Initiative project for sea surface temperature. Wow. I think we can all agree that we have some big brains on the panel today, and I'm discounting myself immediately from that. But I hope you're all ready for some big conversation. I am, by the way, Rob Hutchins, community editor here at Oceanographic, and my role is to be asking all of the questions, which isn't strictly true because the purpose of this kind of roundtable is to really offer you guys tuning in at home or wherever you're watching the chance to ask your questions and feel a part of the conversation too. So please do ask your questions throughout the next 30 minutes of chat, and we will work to get those questions asked for you. There are no stupid questions. I am reliably informed, only stupid answers, but I doubt that anyone here is going to be offering up any of those. I have said far too much, and it's time to get into those questions and start this conversation. So let's start with a word from each of you on this subject this week then, and just to get things rolling. Any surprises in the recent report from any of you? Anyone surprised by what we found? Christopher, perhaps?
Well, I follow this sort of stuff quite closely. I guess it was well trailed from various sources that we were going to see this sort of message coming through. So no, not for me.
No surprises there. Alini?
Yeah, same here. Yeah, so no surprises at all.
No, Dan, inevitably.
Yeah, inevitably, yeah. Sorry, no surprises for me either.
No.
I mean, as you know, like we work with many different partners from around the world, and anecdotally, this change is being felt on the ground at a far faster and more dramatic rate than ever before. So, no surprises, sadly.
Okay. Well, let's get into the real questions then. And Christopher, to turn to you. When you look at the 2025 report's finding that ocean heat content hit a new record high, has this trajectory been visible in the satellite record for years?
Yeah, ocean heat content is really what you need to change in order to warm the climate up. I mean, as you said before, more than 90% of all the heat that is responsible for global warming is absorbed by the oceans. So it's the oceans that really control the rate at which the planet changes. So the ocean heat content has been going up for decades. We weren't really able to measure it that precisely if you go back many decades, but in recent decades, it's become more and more possible. And what we've seen over the last couple of decades is that not only is the heat content going up, but the rate at which it's going up has also increased. And that's a result of the fact that there are increasing amounts of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere driving that.
Yeah, absolutely. And Dan, to turn to you, the report finds that 90% of the ocean's surface experienced at least one marine heat wave in 2025. A lot of Blue Marine's work depends on protected areas being ecologically functional. What does that statistic mean in practice to the viability? This is a big question. Sorry, so to launch into, but what does that statistic mean in practice for the viability of MPAs as a conservation tool right now?
There's a good emerging discipline and school of thought around climate smart marine protected areas. I could certainly put a link in the chat to a previous report that we co-authored on the subject. My peers at Plymouth Marine Laboratory, where I sit on the board, are also doing a lot of work on this topic, but it's really quite cutting edge stuff, and really how marine protected areas respond to a changing climate. That, as you say, that is a huge question. I think fundamentally the premise that a healthier and more resilient ecosystem can withstand climate changes is a pretty good watchword and a pretty good universal rule. And so anywhere that has an effective, proper level of protection is likely to be able to withstand climate change. But when you get down to the, kilometer by kilometer, centimeter by centimeter, I think it's very much an emerging field that very few people really understand. Just in Cornwall, where I live, now we have octopuses, which we didn't have before. Now, that might not, we might not see the changes that that's making within a marine protected area, but there's absolutely no doubt whatsoever that on the seafloor it's making a radical change, and that's just a very, very microscopic, localized incident. So yeah, and same higher up in the water column where you've got bluefin tuna, where you didn't have any a few years ago.
Yeah, no, staggering. And thanks actually for fielding that. I know that was a big question to launch into straight off the bat, so I appreciate that. Alini, to turn to you. So ocean heat content, it's more than doubled its rate of warming since 2005, I believe. How do you even begin to communicate that scale of change to coastal communities in a way that moves them to act rather than to feel like this sense of just, I don't know, I suppose despair or despair might be the word.
I think in my experience, before I can communicate to the communities, they already feel it. Like the coastlines, they are the front line of climate change, the effects of climate change. So it is part of their routine to experience the change firsthand. They feel it in the catch. They feel it in the environment, and climate change is, of course, a global, massive issue, and but it's not perceived equally. It is like we have a massive blanket around the planet, However, the people around the planet, they will have different degrees to which they are prepared to adapt and to protect themselves from the heat. And when it comes to the coastline, where various communities across different climates they exist, they are exposed to various compounding factors, and of course they very much feel that in their livelihoods, not only because there is a shift, there is a massive change, usually a loss of biodiversity, which echoes and reflects in their own economic conditions and, well, livelihoods as a whole, their own health. It's what is impacted. So when it comes to communicating, it is often, in my own experience in the project I have had the opportunity to lead and work on, it's a conversation. It is understanding their side of the story, understanding what they have observed, how that is impacting them, and trying to together find out what can be done to support them, and yeah.
No, yeah, thank you for sharing that. That's really insightful and so crucial as well. My attention's been drawn to a question we've had already from someone tuning in, from Charlie. And I think we've already alluded to this, but it'd be nice to sort of really give a feel for what this means in terms of underwater impact and what we're seeing. And so obviously it's terrible to hear that we're reaching these heat levels, but what does that really look like when you're under the water? Who wants to take it? Chris,
I'll chip in. You will see changes in ecosystems because of the sorts of migrations of species that Dan has already mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
You won't see the heat unless you take a thermometer with you. And what that means is that the thermometer will be a bit higher. And that's not just true at the surface. That's what we're talking about is sort of a long way down, sort of kilometers down in the ocean over time. You have these what sound like relatively modest amounts of temperature rise, but it adds up to an enormous amount of heat. And at the surface, it has these impacts on the species that live in that surface layer.
Yeah, no, thank you. Dan, did you want to chime in or with anything?
I mean, I know very little about this, apart from someone once described it to me as like a slow motion car crash. You know, because these marine heat waves can last for a really, really long time, and as a consequence, you know, the impacts might not be instantaneous, and they might not be visible instantly. They can take a long time to affect certain species, but yeah, it's no less serious as a result.
Yeah, so there's an important difference between heat waves in the ocean and on the land, because the temperature extremes we experience when what we call a heat wave, you know, they can be 5-10 degrees. That's what we call a heat wave. But in the oceans, because water can absorb so much heat, it tends to fluctuate in temperature much less. And animals and other species aren't used to big fluctuations in temperature. They have their annual seasonal change in temperature, the rhythm of the year going past, so they're adapted to that. But the sorts of heat waves we now see in the ocean sound quite small. They're 2-3 degrees maybe, which, you know, on land wouldn't be a heat wave, but they are significant compared to what the species in the ocean are used to. So don't be misled by just hearing these relatively small temperature numbers compared to what we experience in air. The impact is just as important.
Yeah, and actually that's a really interesting point you brought up there, and it does lead into this next question that I had that again is for all three of you, because as people working at the intersection of science and policy and public engagement, what do you think gets lost or sort of smoothed over too readily when the complexity of this scale is distilled into like a single like a headline or a report like this? What nuances get lost? Alini?
I think like quite a lot of detail and catastrophic figures are often shared, and it's not that they are not true in part or totally. It is, I think what gets lost sometimes in the narrative is that there isn't hope, that there isn't something that can be done. And I think the doom and gloom narrative is actually terrible. And I sometimes think, like, is this what my generation wants to basically leave as a legacy for the younger generations and generations to come? Is this hopelessness that is propagated through headlines? And yes, things aren't good, and they haven't been for a while. However, there is a lot that can be done. And I think sometimes when we're talking about science as well, there is, of course, the usual jargons that are used in the text, in the news, etc. But also there is like science as a barrier, something that's very complicated, and therefore the solutions are very complicated too. So often people they're not prompted to stop and think that, you know, this is a problem created by humans, and therefore it is a problem that humans can solve. And I think the focus should be on the solutions, on how can we create the solutions. And like when it comes to policies, when it comes to regulations, to conservation projects, they are all, of course, very important, and often they are the backbone of change. But what sustains the change and make the change relevant and long-lasting is actually the input and the support from the communities and of all people, really, of all levels. So I think that we need, there is in my opinion, a strong need for us to change and drive the change in narratives. Yes, so this report highlights some facts that are not surprising. However, what can we do about them? And that links to a number of other things that we might touch, today in the conversation.
Oh, thanks so much. And actually, my brain's just been fizzing with questions that I'm desperate to make sure I ask each of you, actually. But since we're with you, Alini, and since we were talking there about solutions, it'll be good to get your understanding of what these reports and these sort of headlines or these warnings, what do they mean for sort of the seagrass or the blue carbon ecosystems, those sort of systems that you've studied? Are they still viable as climate solutions at that sort of level of stress that we're looking at?
They're always viable, of course they are. And I think protected areas, they play a very important role in this. So, for example, what happens generally is the temperature of the water increases, and then plants such as seagrass, but we can talk about a variety of other coastal vegetated ecosystems such as mangroves and seagrass. So what happens is the metabolism accelerates, speeds up. And as the temperature of the water increases, the water starts to get rid of the oxygen that is in the water. And because the metabolism of the vegetation increases as well, then they start to produce CO2. And they will eventually also die because they are starving both from nutrients, and that leads to massive die-offs, and therefore seagrass, macroalgae, and salt marshes and mangroves, instead of contributing to trap CO2 and contribute to blue carbon storage and sequestration, they start actually to produce them. So, and as they die off, they will decompose and they will add to the greenhouse gases, if you know what I mean. So these can be really complicated and can be actually a waste of opportunity to use these amazing natural ecosystems to support this vital carbon cycle. So the reason why I mentioned that marine protected areas, they can be an important tool in safeguarding these environments is because an effectively protected marine area can actually guard these ecosystems and then can ensure that they are performing their ecological role in nature.
No, yeah, totally. And actually, that brings me into a question for you, Dan. Is how much of what we're seeing there can be directly linked to issues of overfishing and habitat destruction that better ocean governments could sort of address?
Yeah, I mean, at the moment, I don't think the impacts of climate change are quantified or applied in policy relating to the marine environments by most governments at all. You know, I spent many years trying to convince the UK government to more effectively create policy that recognised the value of the different blue carbon ecosystems around our coast. You know, you take a country like Scotland, where we are now. Scotland has an incredible opportunity to protect the huge sinks and stores of carbon around its coastline, both in the seabed, but also that flow from its kelp forests to protect its salt marshes. And I guess, you know, we're losing all of these things quite fast. Aline, I'm sure you know these figures better than me, but I believe we've lost like 90-something% of our seagrass in the last 50 years. And I believe that similar, you know, I was recently in Ireland talking to conservationists. They've lost, you know, huge quantities of their salt marsh. You know, and the sad thing is that we don't see these habitats, these ecosystems and the functions that they provide. And so it's easy for them to slip away. And, you know, it's hard for people to recognize their value. I guess what we have seen in the last few years, driven by some people actually who are in Edinburgh right now as well, is increasing recognition of blue carbon ecosystems within national policy. And while our government, I think, isn't one of the global leaders, a number of countries have recognized blue carbon ecosystems within their nationally determined contributions, which effectively means that, you know, once that policy is made and the commitments are made at the intergovernmental level, you know, that trickles down into, you know, one would hope into effective protection of those ecosystems. And, you know, a number of countries, Costa Rica, the Seychelles, have, you know, been very, very forward, although Costa Rica has challenging politics right now. They have been historically very, very proactive and progressive in actually taking stock of these ecosystems. But when it comes to the impacts of, you know, industrial extraction, the impacts of different habitats, you know, I think it's a general rule of thumb that as I said earlier in the chat, it's a general rule of thumb that a healthy marine ecosystem is going to be more resilient. And some of the most destructive activities, you know, mobile bottom contact fishing, for instance, you know, it's very clearly proven that reduces biodiversity and therefore resilience. And, you know, that certainly extends into carbon terms. Now, there's a lot of people who have spent a lot of money and who are trying to understand how much, you know, carbon is released back into the atmosphere from bottom trawling. I haven't seen any conclusive science yet on those topics, but, you know, the expectation is that it is quite significant.
Yeah, thanks for that, Dan. From your perspective, Chris, in your studies? Who's leading the charge, and what lessons can we be learning and sort of taking and adapting and adopting ourselves?
Well, I mean, I'm very interested here about the marine protected areas situation. I think this sort of thing is incredibly important for addressing the root cause here. Ultimately, we have rising greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and the potential of restoring blue carbon ecosystems, a bit of jargon there. What it means is, you know, allowing nature to grow again in these areas where we're consistently disrupting with things like bottom trawling. And that is a very cost-effective way of drawing down carbon dioxide from the atmosphere ultimately, and doing ourselves a favor at moderating the rate of global warming. But why are we, you know, thinking about trying to capture carbon dioxide from the air using all sorts of expensive technologies when we can get all sorts of benefits to ecosystems and to the climate from preserving these sorts of areas? So I think it's really important to show that there's multiple benefits to this sort of argument. In general, I think people, you know, the public in general perhaps underestimate two things around this issue. One is how serious global warming is going to be. We're only just at the beginning of the impacts, really. The warming has sort of emerged from the natural variability of the weather, and we're beginning to see the impacts and feel that more commonly. And the trajectory is only going one way. It's going to cost us a lot of money, and there's going to be a lot of disruption on the land and in the ocean from this climate track that we're on if we stay on it. But also, I think we tend to underestimate how much can be done. There's a lot of stuff to be done via ecosystems, but the big story in terms of trying to stabilize the climate is really the switch to renewable energy in the electricity sector. That's where the biggest progress has been made really over the 20 years, I would say. And an illustration of that, just one fact, is that each year the amount of electricity that's consumed around the world is going up. But almost all of that now is being supplied by renewables. It's not bringing the fossil fuel consumption down yet, and AI data centers are a challenge because they are going to accelerate the rate of increase of electricity consumption. Mm-hmm. But the rollout of renewables has been far more exponential, far faster than really economists predicted 10, 15 years ago, than anybody predicted 10, 15 years ago. But we could accelerate it. You know, we could adopt policies that would make that transition faster. And that's really what we need to do, because without stabilizing our climate, we're on an upward trajectory that will cost us more and more and will cause more and more damage. But the amount by which we need to accelerate this transition is not unattainable by any means. With enough focus and enough goodwill and commitment around the world, it could be done. Unfortunately, you look around the world and you see many governments who are going in the opposite direction. And so it's really a political problem. And this is why we need grassroots support for climate action.
Completely. I think, Dan, maybe we could turn to you, and then if I ask what are some of the common headaches and the hurdles that you guys are facing as to the barriers that are in the way for policy change and policy action?
In the context of trying to reach 30 by 30.
Yeah.
You know, I think any marine protected area has a degree of complexity. You know, there's always challenges. There's always things to overcome. You know, I've worked through a great many designations, and then beyond the designation process to the point of, you know, actual implementation and effective implementation. And you know, they never run smooth. You know, there's always impediments. You know, fundamentally, you know, as conservationists on the sort of work that I do, we're ultimately subject to the whims of politicians, and political will, you know, is often quite ephemeral. You know, it's typically you have a good alignment of an administration, and you know, I'm really talking through a political lens. There's many other reasons why marine protected areas can be challenging to you know, both designate and then implement. primarily, you know, industrial resistance. Also, you know, the best marine protected areas are ones that are, you know, that are initiated entirely with the consensus of a local community or a national population even. You know, but there often is, you know, a winner and a loser. If you're talking about highly and fully protected areas, you're often stopping someone from doing something, and that has a human cost and a lifestyle cost, and all of those things need to be considered. You know, I think ultimately, you know, I wouldn't begrudge the billion plus people in the world who rely on seafood as their sole source of protein, access to fish. I mean, that would be a very inhumane thing to propagate. But you know, if you take the context of somewhere like Antarctica, where you know fish are being krill are being caught for you know, to feed farm salmon and pets, and to create wellness supplements primarily by one Norwegian company to profit really a very small group of people. You know, is that right? You know, my instincts as a conservationist is to say absolutely not. That's exploitation of the global commons, and you know, the same whales that Franco's talking about in the chat. I'm glad to got plenty of krill to the north, because in Antarctica it's been the worst couple of years ever. You know, last year they took 620,000 tons for the first time, and so yeah, I mean, there's always impediments to getting marine protected areas over the line, particularly when they're transboundary, particularly when they concern, you know, multiple different jurisdictions. But we are seeing some tremendous forward momentum on that front, and you know, I believe that very shortly we will reach the target of 10% of the world's ocean being hit. Now, that was the target for 2020, as most of you will remember. You know, that's one of the Aichi targets, to reach 10% of ocean protected by 2020. You know, we're 6 years behind, but these are big things. You know, these are big global things, and marine conservation is a relatively new field. Marine protected areas are a relatively new concept. And, you know, obviously once we have them, we need to make them work properly. But I'm seeing hugely positive, and, you know, going to Aline's point, you know, I'm seeing hugely positive, hopeful trajectories and movement in terms of creating large scale protected areas just in the last year. Also seeing some, you know, backward momentum with the pressure on Papahanaumokuakea and, you know, some of the other big global marine protected areas. But there's plenty of reasons for hope. And to Franco's point in the chat, you know, there will be winners and losers in this game. And, you know, I think things like basking sharks and native oysters, I understand, are set to be major beneficiaries of changing temperatures. So, yeah, sorry, I deviated quite hard on that.
I was lapping it up and absorbing all that information, so I appreciate that. But I think it's nice to actually, a nice point to turn to Charlie with all the questions today. So the first one from Charlie, when we talk about restoring the ocean, are we trying to return it to a historical state, or are we now in the business of building climate-ready ecosystems that can survive a much warmer future? And I guess that's open to, I think we could get insight from everyone across that one. So Aline, should we start with yourself?
Sorry, I was trying to press the microphone button. I think a bit of both, because we cannot restore the ecosystems, whole ecosystems, to how they were decades ago, because so much has changed physically. You know, I could be wrong. Perhaps that can be done in some areas, but usually in terms of rewilding, for example, and restoration projects, while it is important to create the environment and the mechanisms that exist to support, that were there before, the massive damage and to support them moving forward. I think things have changed quite a lot. Going back to the coast, for example, we tend to have stronger storms. We tend to have more wave action, in addition to different patterns in rainy seasons across the globe and things like that. So the environment as a whole has changed, and it is very one of the things that I find really cool about rewilding is like to remove the pressures that exist in the area and let the space to heal and find its way back to a stronger self, and without a lot of intervention. So in some places there would be like an active restoration or recovery initiative that's going to be appropriate to be done. In some places, removing the pressure is going to enable the environment to bounce back and to go back to its best potential, perhaps not how it was like 10, 20, 30 years ago, but at a better, stronger condition, I would say. One of the very heartbreaking thing I heard at a workshop I was facilitating about a month ago in Bristol came from a young person who said in the audience, well, how can I know, how can I talk about a beautiful, resilient and healthy environment if all I've seen in my lifetime is degradation and destruction? So that's actually quite sad to know that perception. So yeah, so I think a similar situation can be expected for the environment. It's hard to go back to how it was.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I wonder if, Dan, did you have any further thoughts on that question? Are we now in the business of building climate-ready ecosystems that can survive a much warmer future?
There's some brilliant questions in the chat. I was in the process of answering another one of Charlie's excellent questions.
Yeah, I know. I see.
The ocean has an amazing capacity to recover. If you leave it alone, and while we're unlikely to see a return to the historic state, things can change very quickly in the ocean, both in a positive and a negative way. And just for instance, in the North Sea lately, there's been a huge return of herring, and following those herring, there will be all sorts of other creatures, which is completely unexpected and has no doubt to do with climate change. But ultimately, my point would be around resilience. The more we can protect at the highest possible levels, the more resilient things will be for the future. And while there will be winners and losers, on balance, there'll be far more losers, sadly. And the more we can do to safeguard their futures, the better.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And yeah, totally. This question from Charlie is a great one. So let's get this answered as well. And then we'll come on to a message of hope from everyone. So if a country says that they've met their goal, who is actually checking this? Is there an ocean police that makes sure that they aren't just blue washing the facts? Dan.
So there's a bunch of entities. Some of them are really, really good, like Protected Planet and Marine Protection Atlas, that they are actively looking at all new marine protected area designations. They are vetting them for quality. They're making sure that if they say they're highly and fully protected, that they have some kind of framework and legislation. I guess all of that said, there's zero doubt whatsoever in my mind that many marine protected areas around the world are literally just pieces of paper, sadly. And and that goes for our country. It goes for all sorts of different countries. And they can even be pieces of paper that are, you know, actively, you know, hopeless in preventing industrial activity. But I guess there's two ways of looking at it. The first is like, you know, that's outrageous. They're saying they're doing something. They're standing on the stage and getting plaudits for having protected the environment when they're actually not. And the other way of the counterpoint to that is, a friend described it to me recently, you know, it's a cancer patient. You've got to get them into the hospital bed, you know, and that's what that's, if you're creating a designation and a decree law to do something, at least then you have a framework around which effective implementation can be built. Now, what I see, it totally varies around the world. Like some countries, some entities, some NGOs, you know, they will want to create absolutely everything ahead of designation. They'll need to have a management plan. They'll need to know where all of the cost of monitoring and enforcement comes from. And I think that that is a really, really worthwhile aspiration. However, we are in an extremely time precious environment. There's not very long until 2030. As you know, we're just hitting 10% of ocean, not even highly and fully protected, just protected in any way, shape or form. There's a huge amount of work before we hit 2030, which is only 4 years away, you know, and there's just an unbelievable amount to be done. And so I guess the more kind of political momentum, the more countries that come together around sorting this out and actually getting this framework, you know, basically hitting target 3 of the global biodiversity framework, from my perspective, from where I'm sitting, the better. And obviously there's going to need to be some kind of fund, some kind of global fund, like the Global Fund for Coral Reefs, for marine protected area implementation. And I know there's many people working on this already, but I'd expect that in the future, countries will be able to draw on a resource like that can turn what ultimately are pieces of paper into reality. Now, I'm not in any way advocating for paper parks. I think it's a total waste of time, and you know, it's not a good thing for anyone to be hiding behind that. But I guess also I see many NPAs come into life, and then afterwards it can take many years until the point where fish are actually getting saved, which is, you know, the name of the game. So great question. I mean, I think, Charlie, I would love to see some kind of ocean police. Perhaps we could set one up. I like it a lot.
Yeah, be awesome. Imagine the uniforms, they'd be great. Thanks for that, Dan. I'm totally conscious of time, and I don't want to be taking up too much of your time. And I really appreciate the energy that you're giving to this conversation. And I've not even touched the surface of the number of questions that I've got here for each of you. So to turn this to yourself, Christopher, and to ask you, because you alluded to this note of optimism and hope. So after a year like 2024 and a report like this one from the World Meteorological Organization, does your optimism hold?
Well, I guess my optimism is based on the fact that it is feasible now to continue to allow people to thrive on our planet whilst having an energy source that isn't fossil fuels. That is now technically feasible. So that is a big change from 15 years ago, where it just looked infeasible. And so that potential is there. It's a question of whether we are committed enough to grab that potential at a global scale fast enough. So I'm actually more optimistic than I was. My first career was in the electricity industry. I joined in the electricity industry in the UK at the time we were burning peak coal. And just a year or two ago, the UK stopped burning coal altogether. Huge changes are possible, but just now, the world is not going in the right direction. So we need to double down on the idea that this is hugely important for the future generations that will follow us. And I think we have an opportunity. Solar and wind are an opportunity to turn this around. Let's take it.
Thanks for that. You know what? I think that's the first time that I've actually asked a professor or a scientist in this space a question like that and been presented an optimistic answer. And that the fact that you're more optimistic now than you were before, that's great. Eleni, to turn to you in these sort of closing questions, totally aware of time, what is a single shift in public understanding that you believe is most urgently needed?
I think it's emphasizing exactly what Chris just said. It's like, I also feel very optimistic, and I think there is a lot of room for hope. I think in terms of understanding, we need to get people to understand this, that actually learning more about ocean, about climate, and actually that ocean is not the backdrop of the climate crisis. It is very much at the center of it. And that actually learning how the ocean functions and being active in this. I think one of the things that needs changing is that we as scientists provide a lot of information on what is going on, and I think more and more scientists are communicating how to engage, how to support the positive change, to drive this change, and this needs to continue. We need to continue to communicate and to provide tools to all really on how to change this game and to improve life on Earth, really, not only for us, but for decades ahead, future generations. And yes, I also feel very hopeful, and it would be very difficult. Like you should be worried if I working at the intersection or in the interface with communities and policies and scientists. If I didn't feel hope, I wouldn't be able to do my job. But the thing is that I do. I think we need to focus on the many infinite possibilities, positive possibilities out there.
No, yeah, absolutely. Oh, thanks so much, Eleni, and look, thanks everyone. And I could genuinely talk forever, and just to go through these questions I've got you. But Dan, just to close this out, what is the single policy change, domestically or internationally, that this report should make impossible now to delay any longer?
Well, listen, I was going to talk to the whales really quickly, because building on Chris's point about hope, with humpback whales, probably the most iconic marine species. When my parents were young in the early 60s, they almost went extinct. Very, very nearly. I don't know what the population got down to, but small number of thousands. And now they've recovered to pre-whaling levels. And so there's very, very clear signs that if you leave the ocean alone, then it will recover. And I think in the context of the high seas, the new treaty, the BBNJ, in the context of Antarctica, where there's new momentum to making sure that the countries who are responsible for Antarctica actually do their job and effectively protect at least 2% of the ocean, which is what's on the table in the marine protected areas there. I would like to see us be able to get those things right, where there's very, very few people for the global commons for the world. Those to me are kind of petri dishes where if we get those right, we can hit this global target, and there will be immense hope generated through that.
Yeah. Absolutely. Dan, look, thanks so much. And thank you, Christopher, and thank you, Eleni, and thank you, everyone, for sharing your insight and your energy and expertise and answering all those questions. You've all been wonderful. Everyone chiming in at home has been wonderful. Charlie's been particularly wonderful with all the questions there. So thank you to everyone who has tuned in to listen and watch. If you've enjoyed this roundtable session, we will be back next week, same time, same place, to tackle next week's biggest story. So do check out the Oceanographic platform for the latest details on that, as well as the latest details on our live Ocean Talks events, as well as our printed magazine and everything else that we have to offer. So that leaves me with nothing else to say other than one big thank you so much to everyone for joining this afternoon, and thanks to our experts once again. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob.
Take care.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.